Question 1. In a situation where efficiency decreases across multiple levels of government, how should the powers of Congress under the Commerce Clause be interpreted when regulating interstate commerce? A. Congress can only regulate interstate commerce if there is a direct and substantial effect on interstate trade according to the substantial effects doctrine. B. Congress has broad authority to regulate any economic activity that even indirectly affects interstate commerce based on the necessary and proper cause. C. Congress is limited to regulating activities that involve goods crossing state lines and cannot regulate within state. D. Congress's powers under the Commerce Clause extend only to activities that directly affect the national economy and not the local economy. Answer. B. Congress has broad authority to regulate any economic activity that even indirectly affects interstate commerce based on the necessary and proper cause. Explanation. The Commerce Clause grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. This has been interpreted broadly through landmark cases such as Wickard v. Filburn 1942, which upheld Congress's ability to regulate interstate activities that substantially affect interstate commerce, even if the activity itself does not directly involve interstate transactions. Additionally, the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to pass laws that are necessary to execute its powers under the Commerce Clause, further extending its regulatory reach. For instance, Congress can regulate economic activities like local farming if they collectively affect national markets. Options A, C, and D limit Congress's powers by misinterpreting the scope of the Commerce Clause. Question 2. During a critical transition period where existing processes of state governance conflict with federal mandates, how should the Supremacy Clause be applied to determine the relationship between state and federal laws? A. Federal law always takes precedence over state law, even if the state law is more restrictive or stricter in certain areas. B. State law can supersede federal law if the state law does not conflict with a federal mandate and provides additional protections. C. Federal law prevails over state law when there is a direct conflict, but the state law remains valid if it provides a level of protection not covered by federal law. D. State can override federal law when it reflects the interests of the state's citizens, especially in areas like education and healthcare. Answer. C. Federal law prevails over state law when there is a direct conflict, but the state law remains valid if it provides a level of protection not covered by federal law. Explanation. The Supremacy Clause, found in Article Romans for a Constitution, establishes that federal law is the supreme law of the land and that state laws must yield when they conflict with federal laws. However, if there is no conflict, such as when state law additional protections beyond federal law, the states can impose stricter regulations. This was affirmed in cases like Arizona v. United States 2012, where the court ruled that state laws that conflict with federal immigration law are invalid, but states can provide additional protections in other areas like labor or environmental law. Options A, B, and D either misstate the relationship or fail to acknowledge the possibility of state laws adding protections beyond federal mandates. Question 3. In the case where a state has enacted a law that treats individuals differently based on gender, which standard of scrutiny would be applied under the Equal Protection Clause to assess the law's constitutionality? A. Rational basis review requiring the state to prove a reasonable link between the law and a legitimate state interest. B. Intermediate scrutiny, where the state must demonstrate that the law is substantially related to an important government interest. C. Strict scrutiny, requiring the state to show that the law is necessary to achieve a compelling state interest. D. Deferential review, allowing the state to enforce the law without needing to provide compelling or important government interest. Answer. B. Intermediate scrutiny, where the state must demonstrate that the law is substantially related to an important government interest. Explanation. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment mandates that laws cannot treat individuals differently based on certain characteristics unless there is a legitimate, justifiable reason for doing so. Gender-based classifications typically fall under intermediate scrutiny, as established in Craig v. Boren 1976, where the court ruled that laws discriminating based on gender must be substantially related to an important government interest. This is a middle level of scrutiny, more rigorous than rational basis review, but less demanding than strict scrutiny, which applies to classifications based on race or national origin. Thus, the state must provide a substantial connection between the law and an important government interest to justify such a classification. Option A represents a lower standard, and option C would apply to racial or national origin classifications, not gender. Option D is not applicable as it disregards the scrutiny required under the Equal Protection Clause. Question 4. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted by a national crisis, how should the separation of powers be interpreted when the executive branch assumes broad powers to address the crisis? A. The executive branch has unfettered discretion to act without congressional or judicial review during national emergencies. B. The executive branch may take extraordinary actions, but must still operate within the constitutional framework with Congress and the judiciary retaining oversight. C. The executive branch's powers are inherently limited to pre-established emergency protocols and cannot extend beyond those boundaries. Congress may delegate its legislative powers entirely to the executive branch during national emergency. Answer B. The executive branch may take extraordinary actions, but must still operate within the constitutional framework with Congress and the judiciary retaining oversight. Explanation. While the executive branch does have increased powers during national emergencies, particularly under the War Powers Resolution and other emergency powers laws, these powers are not unlimited. The Constitution's separation of powers ensures that Congress, judiciary maintain oversight even in times of crisis. For example, while the President may issue emergency declarations and use executive orders to address urgent national issues, these actions are still subject to judicial review and congressional oversight. The Court has consistently held that the executive's actions cannot override the checks and balances system, ensuring that no branch becomes too powerful. Options A, C, and D misstate the scope of executive powers or disregard the vital role of checks and balances. Question 5. In a case where a state enacts a law requiring all private businesses to post a sign promoting certain religious principles, which First Amendment principle is most likely to be challenged by opponents of the law? A. Freedom of speech, as businesses are compelled to express a message with which they disagree. B. Freedom of assembly, as the law infringes on private citizens' ability to gather in their own spaces freely. C. Free exercise clause, as it forces businesses to conform to religious principles regardless of their own practices. D. Establishment clause, as the law promotes religious principle within the public sphere. Answer D. Establishment clause, as the law promotes a religious principle within the public sphere. Explanation. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from making laws that establish an official religion or promote religious beliefs. A state law that requires businesses to post signs promoting religious principles would likely be seen as government involvement in religion, which violates this clause. In contrast, the free exercise attains to individuals' rights to practice their religion, and the freedom of speech would not apply unless the law forced businesses to make statement against their will. The Establishment Clause challenge would focus on the excessive government entanglement with religion in the public and private sectors. Question 6. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges regarding individual rights are present, how should the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment be applied to ensure fairness in the criminal justice system? A. The Due Process Clause ensures that individuals are provided all available resources, including financial support, to defend themselves in court. B. The Due Process Clause guarantees that the government follows fair procedures when depriving individuals of life, liberty, or property. C. The Due Process Clause only applies to federal actions, and state laws are free to disregard procedural fairness. D. The Due Process Clause mandates that individuals who are convicted of serious crimes are entitled to legal procedures. Answer B. The Due Process Clause guarantees that the government follows fair procedures when depriving individuals of life, liberty, or property. Explanation. The Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause requires that the government cannot deprive an individual of life, liberty, or property without providing due process of law, which includes both substantive and procedural fairness. This clause ensures that legal proceedings are conducted fairly, including notice and opportunity to be heard before an impartial tribunal. This applies to federal actions, and through the 14th Amendment's incorporation doctrine, it also applies to state actions. It does not guarantee financial support for legal representation, as suggested in Option A, nor does it limit fairness only to serious crimes as in D. Option C is incorrect, as the Due Process Clause also applies to state actions. Question 7. When analyzing the constitutionality of A state law that imposes restrictions on the right to bear arms. How should the Second Amendment be interpreted in light of contemporary debates over gun control? A. The Second Amendment guarantees an absolute right to own and carry firearms without any regulation. B. The Second Amendment allows for reasonable regulations on firearms provided they do not infringe on the core right to self-defense. C. The Second Amendment applies only to militia groups and not to individual citizens. D. The Second Amendment's protections are limited to those who are involved in law enforcement or the military. Answer: B. The Second Amendment allows for reasonable regulations on firearms provided they do not infringe on the core right to self-defense. Explanation: the Second Amendment protects the individual right to keep and bear arms, but this right is not absolute. The Supreme Court has ruled in District of Columbia v. Heller 2008 that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms, particularly self-defense. However, this right can be subject to reasonable regulations, such as background checks, limitations on certain types of weapons, and restrictions on carrying firearms in certain public spaces. This interpretation recognizes the core right to self-defense while allowing for regulatory measures to ensure public safety. Option A misrepresents the scope of the Second Amendment, and options C and D are outdated and incorrect interpretations of the individual right. Question 8. When developing a legal framework that respects both federal and state powers, how should the Commerce Clause and the 10th Amendment be balanced in the context of state regulation? A. The Commerce Clause overrides any state law that restricts or burdens interstate commerce, even if the law is beneficial for the state's economy. B. The 10th Amendment prohibits Congress from regulating any activity that is not expressly authorized by the Constitution, leaving all regulatory power to the states. C. The Commerce Clause grants Congress exclusive authority to regulate commerce, but the 10th Amendment reserves powers delegated to the federal government to the states. D. The Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate only activities that directly involve interstate commerce, and the 10th Amendment provides states with authority over all other matters. Answer: C. The Commerce Clause grants Congress exclusive authority to regulate commerce, but the 10th Amendment reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. Explanation: the Commerce Clause grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, which has been interpreted broadly in cases like Gibbons v. Ogden 1824 and Wickard v. Filburn 1942. However, the 10th Amendment reserves powers not granted to the federal government to the states, ensuring a system of federalism. This means that while Congress can regulate interstate commerce, states retain the ability to regulate local matters not preempted by federal law. Option A disregards the reserved powers of the states, and Option B overstates the scope of the 10th Amendment by restricting Congress's regulatory powers. Option D is partially correct but doesn't account for the full range of federal authority granted by the Commerce Clause. Question 9. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in the application of judicial review, how should Marbury v. Madison's principle of judicial review be applied in modern constitutional disputes? A. Judicial review only applies in cases involving questions of individual rights or property rights, not in cases related to the scope of government powers. B. Judicial review allows the courts to declare laws unconstitutional, but only in cases where law is manifestly unjust or discriminatory. C. Judicial review permits courts to invalidate laws and executive actions that conflict with the Constitution, ensuring the Constitution remains the supreme law. D. Judicial review is a procedural tool that only applies in instances where an individual sues the government directly. Answer: C. Judicial review permits courts to invalidate laws and executive actions that conflict with the Constitution, ensuring that the Constitution remains the supreme law. Explanation: the principle of judicial review, established in Marbury v. Madison 1803, grants the judiciary the authority to review the constitutionality of legislative and executive actions. This power ensures that no law or governmental action can supersede the Constitution, maintaining its supremacy as the fundamental law of the land. Judicial review applies broadly to cases involving both government powers and individual rights, not just property or civil rights. Option B misrepresents the role of judicial review, as it is not limited to cases involving injustice or discrimination. Option D is also incorrect, as judicial review can be initiated in various types of cases, not just those involving individuals suing the government. Question 10. In the scenario where the government asserts national security concerns to justify curtailing certain civil liberties, what test should courts apply to determine whether these actions are constitutional under the First Amendment and other fundamental rights? A. Strict scrutiny, requiring the government to prove that the actions are necessary to achieve a compelling state interest and that no less restrictive alternatives are available. B. Intermediate scrutiny, where the government must show that the actions are substantially related to an important government interest. C. Rational basis review, where the government must show that the actions are reasonable and not arbitrary. D. National security scrutiny. Government's assertions of national security are given broad deference. Answer A. Strict scrutiny, requiring the government to prove that the actions are necessary to achieve a compelling state interest and that no less restrictive alternatives are available. Explanation: when the government asserts national security as a justification for restricting civil liberties such as freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, the courts typically apply strict scrutiny. This is the highest level of judicial review, which requires the government to show that the restriction is necessary to achieve a compelling state interest, e.g., national security, and that the measure is narrowly tailored to achieve that goal with no less restrictive alternatives available. This standard ensures that individual rights are not unduly compromised for purposes like national security. Option D is incorrect because courts do not give broad deference to government claims without judicial review. Options B and C are lower levels of scrutiny and do not apply in cases involving fundamental rights. Question 11. While analyzing a case involving a state law that prohibits the sale of certain goods based on their intended use, how should the court balance the state's interest in regulating commerce with the individual constitutional rights of sellers and consumers under the Commerce Clause and the Due Process Clause? A. The court should uphold the state law, as the Commerce Clause gives states broad authority to regulate commercial activities within their borders. B. The law should be struck down if it excessively burdens interstate commerce, violating the Dormant Commerce Clause, but only if the state's interest is not substantial. C. The court should analyze whether the law violates the Due Process Clause by unduly restricting the freedom of individuals to engage in commerce. D. The court must first determine if the law violates the state constitution before evaluating its effects on commerce or individual rights. Answer B. The law should be struck down if it excessively burdens interstate commerce, violating the Dormant Commerce Clause, but only if the state's interest is not substantial. Explanation: the Commerce Clause grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce and prohibits states from passing laws that unduly burden interstate commerce. When analyzing state regulations, the Dormant Commerce Clause prohibits laws that discriminate against, excessively burden interstate commerce. The court will often apply balancing tests to determine if the state's interests in regulating commerce outweigh the effects on interstate trade. If state law excessively interferes with interstate commerce without offering significant benefits, it is likely to be struck down. The Due Process Clause does not directly address this issue, but may come into play if the law unfairly limits economic freedom. Question 12. In a case where a state legislature enacts a law banning the teaching of certain controversial historical events in public schools, how should the court address the law in light of the First Amendment and the principle of academic freedom? A. The law is constitutional, as states have the authority to regulate educational content in their public schools, regardless of the First Amendment. B. The court should apply strict scrutiny, as the law directly restricts the free expression of teachers and students, possibly violating the First Amendment. C. The law is likely to be upheld if the state can show that the restrictions are necessary for maintaining public order in the educational system. D. First Amendment does not apply in the context of education, so the law can be upheld without further scrutiny. Answer B. The court should apply strict scrutiny, as the law directly restricts the free expression of teachers and students, possibly violating the First Amendment. Explanation: the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and expression, including the academic freedom of educators and students. When a state enacts a law that restricts the teaching of particular ideas or historical events, the court must determine whether the law infringes upon fundamental right of free speech. Given that the law directly interferes with educators' ability to teach and students' ability to receive diverse ideas, strict scrutiny should apply. The state must demonstrate a compelling governmental interest, and the law must be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. In this context, the law's restriction on teaching historical events would likely be viewed as a violation of the First Amendment. Question 13. In a scenario where a federal law preempts state laws regarding environmental regulations, what standard should the court use to determine if the state law can stand in light of the supremacy clause? A. The court should always uphold federal laws over state laws, even if the state law provides stronger protections for the environment. B. The court should first analyze whether the federal law clearly preempts the state law, focusing on the language of the federal statute and congressional intent. C. The court will only strike down the state law if it is proven to be unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment. D. The state law can stand if it is consistent with the federal law's objectives, even if it conflicts with the federal law's specific provisions. Answer. B. The court should first analyze whether the federal law clearly preempts the state law, focusing on the language of the federal statute and congressional intent. Explanation. Under the Supremacy Clause, Article omens federal law is supreme over state law when there is a conflict. However, courts must carefully analyze whether a federal law explicitly or implicitly preempts a state law. This analysis involves looking at the language of the statute and understanding congressional intent. If Congress has explicitly stated that federal law preempts state law, or if preemption is implied by the structure or purpose of the federal law, the court will strike down the state law. The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states, but this does not necessarily prevent federal preemption in areas where Congress has acted. Question 14. In a case involving a challenge to a state law requiring a waiting period for the purchase of firearms, how should the court balance public safety concerns with the individual right to bear arms under the Second Amendment? A. The court should apply a strict scrutiny test to determine whether the law is narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling governmental interest, as the Second Amendment is a fundamental right. B. The court should apply intermediate scrutiny, allowing the state to regulate firearms in a manner that addresses public safety concerns without unduly restricting the right to bear arms. C. The court should uphold the law as a reasonable regulation of the amendment rights to prevent harm to the community. D. The court should invalidate the law as any regulation of firearm ownership is inherently unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. Answer. B. The court should apply intermediate scrutiny, allowing the state to regulate firearms in a manner that addresses public safety concerns without unduly restricting the right to bear arms. Explanation. While the Second Amendment protects the individual right to bear arms, the court has recognized that this right is not absolute and can be subject to regulation. The standard of review applied depends on the nature of the regulation. Involving firearm regulations, such as waiting periods, the court typically applies intermediate scrutiny. This standard allows the state to regulate firearms in a way that balances the public's interest in safety and the individual's right to bear arms. The law must be tailored to address a substantial governmental interest, such as public safety, without unduly burdening the exercise of the Second Amendment right. Question 15. In a case where a government agency uses surveillance technologies to monitor the activities of individuals in public spaces, how should the court assess the constitutionality of the surveillance under the Fourth Amendment? A. The court should automatically uphold the surveillance as it occurs in public spaces where individuals have no reasonable expectation of privacy. B. The court should apply a balancing test weighing the government's interest in security against individuals' rights to privacy under the Fourth Amendment. C. The Fourth Amendment does not apply to any form of surveillance, as there is no expectation of privacy in public areas. D. The court should require for any form of surveillance, even in public spaces, to protect against unreasonable searches and seizures. Answer. B. The court should apply a balancing test weighing the government's interest in security against individuals' rights to privacy under the Fourth Amendment. Explanation. The Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures, but its application in public spaces is more nuanced. In cases involving surveillance technologies, the court must determine whether the use of such technology constitutes an unreasonable search. Individuals may have diminished expectation of privacy in public spaces. Surveillance technologies that capture detailed or prolonged information about individuals' movements or activities may still raise constitutional concerns. The court will typically apply balancing test, considering the government's interest in security and law enforcement against the individual's right to privacy. Question 16. While evaluating a case where a state law requires public officials to take a religious oath of office, how should the court address the law in light of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? A. The law is constitutional as it reflects the state's religious heritage and does not violate the Establishment Clause. B. The court should apply the Lemon test, determining whether the law has secular purpose, does not primarily advance or inhibit religion, and does not excessively entangle government with religion. C. The law can be upheld if the state can show that the religious oath does not establish preference for any particular religion. D. The establishment does not apply to state laws, so the law can be upheld without any constitutional analysis. Answer: B. The court should apply the Lemon test, determining whether the law has a secular purpose, does not primarily advance or inhibit religion, and does not excessively entangle government with religion. Explanation: The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment prohibits government from establishing a religion or favoring one religion over another in cases involving religious oaths or symbols. The court applies the Lemon test, which evaluates where government action has a secular purpose, whether it primarily advances or inhibits religion, and whether it excessively entangles government with religion. If the law fails any part of this test, it is likely to be struck down as unconstitutional. States may not compel religious expressions from public officials in a way that violates the separation of church and state. Question 17. In a case where the federal government seeks to use eminent domain to seize private property for a public purpose, how should the court evaluate the constitutionality of the taking under the Fifth Amendment? A. The government can seize any property it deems necessary for public use, regardless of compensation. B. The government must provide just compensation only if the taking is directly for public infrastructure, such as roads or bridges. C. The taking must meet the public use requirement and provide just compensation to the property owner. D. The government cannot seize private property under any circumstances as property right, inviolable under the Fifth Amendment. Answer: C. The taking must meet the public use requirement and provide just compensation to the property owner. Explanation: The Fifth Amendment's takings clause permits the government to take private property for public use, but it requires that the property owner receive just compensation. The court has interpreted the public use requirement to allow government action for a broad range of purposes, including public infrastructure projects and development. However, the property owner is entitled to fair compensation for the property taken. The government cannot take property for purely private purposes, and the court will scrutinize whether the taking meets the public use requirement. Question 18. In a case where a state enacts a law that restricts abortion access after a certain number of weeks, how should the court assess the constitutionality of the law in light of the precedent set by Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey? A. The court should uphold the law if it does not impose an absolute ban on abortion, as long as it respects the viability standard. B. The court should strike down the law because it places an undue burden on a woman's right to choose. C. The court should uphold the law if the state demonstrates a compelling interest in protecting the health of the mother and the potential life of the fetus. D. The court should rule that the law is unconstitutional under the amendment because abortion regulation is a state matter. Answer: B. The court should strike down the law because it places an undue burden on a woman's right to choose. Explanation: In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the court established the undue burden standard, which prohibits state regulations that place significant obstacles in the path of women seeking an abortion before fetal viability. Law that restricts abortion access after a certain number of weeks may be challenged if it imposes an undue burden. Woman's right to choose. The court will evaluate whether the law significantly limits access to abortion and whether it violates the constitutional right established in Roe v. Wade. Question 19. In a case where a state seeks to regulate the practice of assisted suicide, how should the court balance the state's interest in preserving life with an individual's right to liberty under the 14th Amendment? A. The court should uphold the law as valid exercise of the state's power to protect life, regardless of individual liberty concerns. B. The court should apply strict scrutiny and strike down the law if it imposes an unjustifiable burden on an individual's right to choose death. C. The court should apply rational basis review and defer to the state's interest in protecting life, even if it limits individual rights. D. The 14th Amendment applies to questions of assisted suicide, so the law can be upheld without further review. Answer: C. The court should apply rational basis review and defer to the state's interest in protecting life, even if it limits individual rights. Explanation: The 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause guarantees individuals certain liberties, but these liberties are subject to limitations when the state has legitimate interest, such as protecting life. In cases like assisted suicide, the court often applies rational basis review, which allows the state to regulate behavior as long as the regulation is reasonable and serves legitimate government interest. The court would likely defer to the state's interest in preserving life, even if it limits an individual's right to end their own life. Question 20. In a case where a state law conflicts with a federal law, particularly regarding the regulation of firearms, and the state argues that its law is a valid exercise of police powers, which of the following constitutional principles would most likely govern the resolution of this issue? A. The Supremacy Clause. B. The Privileges and Immunities Clause. C. The Commerce Clause. D. The 10th Amendment. Answer A. The Supremacy Clause. Explanation. The Supremacy Clause, Article Omens Clause 2, dictates that when state laws conflict with federal laws, the federal law takes precedence. In this case, if the state law regulating firearms contradicts federal firearm regulations, the federal law would override the state law under the Supremacy Clause. While states have powers reserved to them through the 10th Amendment, those powers cannot be exercised in that conflict with federal law in areas where federal power is supreme, such as interstate commerce or matters under federal regulation like firearm laws. Question 21. During a critical period of judicial review, the U.S. Supreme Court examines whether a federal statute that mandates surveillance of citizens for national security purposes infringes on individuals' constitutional rights. Which constitutional provision would be most relevant in evaluating the constitutionality of such a statute? A. The Fourth Amendment. B. The First Amendment. C. The Sixth Amendment. D. The Fifth Amendment. Answer A. The Fourth Amendment. Explanation. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures and requires that warrants be issued based on probable cause. In this case, a statute mandating surveillance could violate the protections guaranteed under the Fourth Amendment if it involves searches or seizures without due process or without a warrant based on probable cause. Although national security concerns can involve interpretations of constitutional rights, the Fourth Amendment remains a critical check on government overreach in surveillance programs. Question 22. In a situation where a state law seeks to ban same-sex marriage and the law is challenged on the grounds that it violates constitutional protections, which of the following cases would the court most likely reference to resolve this issue? A. Plessy v. Ferguson. B. Brown v. Board of Education. C. Obergefell v. Hodges. D. Citizens United v. Feck. Answer C. Obergefell v. Hodges. Explanation. In Obergefell v. Hodges 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the 14th Amendment's equal protection and due process clauses guarantee the right of same-sex couples to marry. This landmark decision legalized same-sex marriage nationwide and would be directly referenced in any case challenging a state law that attempts to ban same-sex marriage. The case established that states cannot deny marriage rights to same-sex couples, reinforcing the principles of equality and liberty under the Constitution. Question 23. During a comprehensive review of a state's law prohibiting certain forms of speech in the workplace, court must determine whether the law violates the First Amendment's protections on free speech. What standard of review will the court most likely apply to determine if the speech is protected or if it is justifiably restricted? A. Rational basis review. B. Intermediate scrutiny. C. Strict scrutiny. D. Reasonable restriction test. Answer C. Strict scrutiny. Explanation. The strict scrutiny standard is applied when a law infringes upon fundamental rights such as the First Amendment right to free speech. Under this standard, the government must demonstrate that the law serves a compelling governmental interest and that the law is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. Since free speech is a fundamental right, restrictions on speech in the workplace must meet this rigorous standard. Laws restricting speech are subject to close examination, and if they fail to meet these criteria, they are likely to be deemed unconstitutional. Question 24. In a situation where a state law attempts to regulate the medical use of marijuana in direct conflict with federal law that classifies marijuana as a controlled substance, which of the following constitutional principles would the court primarily rely on to resolve the conflict? A. Preemption doctrine. B. Necessary and proper clause. C. Full faith and credit clause. D. Equal protection clause. Answer A. Preemption doctrine. Explanation. The preemption doctrine arises from the Supremacy Clause in Article Romans 5 Constitution, which holds that federal law overrides state law when they are in conflict. In this scenario, since the federal government classifies marijuana as a controlled substance, the state law regulating its medical use would be preempted by federal law unless there is a specific constitutional exemption or the government chooses not to enforce the law in that state. Courts apply preemption to resolve conflicts between state and federal laws that affect areas of federal jurisdiction, such as drug regulation. Question 25. When a U.S. citizen is denied the right to vote due to a state law that imposes a literacy test, which constitutional amendment would most likely be cited to challenge the law on the grounds of racial discrimination and disenfranchisement? A. 13th Amendment. B. 15th Amendment. C. 19th Amendment. D. 24th Amendment. Answer: B. 15th Amendment. Explanation: the 15th Amendment prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. A literacy test, if applied in a discriminatory manner to disenfranchise racial minorities, would likely be challenged under this amendment. Historically, literacy tests were used to suppress voting rights, particularly for African Americans in the South, and courts have ruled that such practices violate the 15th Amendment. Question 26. During a major transformation of the nation's healthcare system, the U.S. Congress passes legislation requiring all citizens to purchase health insurance. Plaintiff challenges this mandate by claiming it exceeds Congress's power. Which clause of the U.S. Constitution is most relevant to determining whether Congress has the authority to enact such law? A. The Commerce Clause. B. The General Welfare Clause. C. The Necessary and Proper Clause. D. The Spending Power Clause. Answer: A. The Commerce Clause. Explanation: the Commerce Clause, Article I, Section 8, Clause 3, grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce in cases like National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius 2012. The Supreme Court analyzed whether the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act account fell within the scope of the Commerce Clause. The court ruled that while Congress could regulate economic activity under the Commerce Clause, the individual mandate was not justified as regulation of interstate commerce. However, the taxing and spending clause was ultimately used to justify the mandate. Question 27. While investigating a complicated issue between different branches of government regarding executive orders and legislative authority, which of the following doctrines would be most important in determining whether the executive action oversteps its constitutional authority? A. Separation of powers. B. Equal protection. C. Federalism. D. Rule of law. Answer: A. Separation of powers. Explanation: the separation of powers doctrine underlies the structure of the U.S. Constitution, dividing governmental powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. When there is a dispute about whether the executive branch is overstepping its authority, courts will examine whether the executive is encroaching upon powers reserved for Congress or the judiciary. Executive orders must align with the constitutional limits of executive power as prescribed in Ratico Omen to not infringe upon legislative or judicial authority. Question 20. In a case where the government imposes strict regulations on certain forms of protest, which standard of scrutiny will the court most likely apply to determine if the regulation is constitutional under the First Amendment? A. Strict scrutiny. B. Rational basis review. C. Intermediate scrutiny. D. Content-neutral test. Answer: A. Strict scrutiny. Explanation: when a law significantly restricts free speech, the strict scrutiny standard is used. This requires the government to show that the regulation is necessary to serve a compelling governmental interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. Laws that burden speech, particularly on public forums or protests, are carefully scrutinized as the First Amendment protections of free speech and assembly are fundamental. Question 29. During a legal challenge to a state's voting rights law that imposes voter ID requirement, which constitutional principle would most likely be used to determine whether the law disproportionately affects minority voters? A. Equal Protection Clause. B. Privileges and Immunities Clause. C. Due Process Clause. D. Full Faith and Credit Clause. Answer: A. Equal Protection Clause. Explanation: the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. In cases involving voting laws, particularly those that disproportionately affect minority groups, courts evaluate whether the law creates an unfair burden on certain groups. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and equal protection challenges, often invoked in cases where voter ID laws or other requirements are seen as discriminatory. Question 30. In a scenario where Congress enacts a law imposing heavy fines on a company for environmental violations, and the company challenges the law as an excessive penalty, which constitutional amendment will likely be referenced in the court's analysis of whether the fine is permissible? A. 8th Amendment. B. 5th Amendment. C. 10th Amendment. D. 1st Amendment. Answer A. 8th Amendment. Explanation. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. In this context, the company may challenge the fine on the grounds that it is excessive and punitive in nature, violating the protections of the Eighth Amendment. Courts will assess whether the fine is disproportionate to the violation and whether it constitutes an excessive penalty in relation to the harm caused.